In 2018, when the Modi government announced its ambitious lateral entry reform, a fierce debate over generalists versus domain experts broke out in the country. In a sharply worded letter to the Prime Minister, the Indian Revenue Service Association said that officers of non-IAS services too were domain experts, but ignored due to the arbitrary and discriminatory system of empanelment and selection of officers at higher levels in the government. The government, they said, should use the in-house domain expertise it already has within the government and not just go to the private sector. 10 years into the Modi government, non-IAS officers are in a clear majority at the level of joint secretaries, often considered the most important position in the central government. According to data obtained by ThePrint under the Right to Information Act, of the 236 joint secretaries serving at the centre, 156 officers, that is over 66%, are non-IAS officers. The service to benefit the most from the IAS's diminishing dominance are the relatively low-profile railway services. 32 of the joint secretaries serving in the Government of India belong to various streams of railway services, including the Railway Service of Mechanical Engineering, Indian Railway Service of Signal Engineers, Railway Traffic Service, among others. The railway services are followed by the officers of the Indian Revenue Service, with 23 IRS officers, including 7 officers belonging to the IRS Customs and 16 officers belonging to IRS Income Tax. The much less glamorous Central Secretariat Service, often known as the permanent bureaucracy, who unlike other civil servants always stay in the central government in New Delhi, come a close third. 21 CSS officers are currently posted as joint secretaries. Officers of the Indian Forest Service, Indian Accounts and Audit Service, Indian Postal Service constitute 16, 12 and 8 of the total joint secretaries presently working in the centre. You can see a complete list of which officers make up the joint secretary ranks at the centre on your screen. Now let's try to make sense of the numbers. The numbers show a complete makeover of the Indian bureaucracy at one of its most pivotal positions from even until 5 to 6 years ago, when the IAS completely dominated these ranks. Obviously, the makeover is a cause of celebration for non-IAS officers. For decades, they have been treated as inferior to their IAS counterparts, at least that's what they say. From positions in the government to post-retirement jobs, the most plum jobs in the government have been the exclusive preserve of the IAS. But not under the government of Prime Minister Narendra Modi, who has criticized the quote-unquote general IAS officers running every department and ministry in the government on the floor of the parliament. But the induction of non-IAS officers in central government ranks does not necessarily mean that there is a push for domain expertise within the government. According to data obtained through the RTI, officers from very specialized services like accounts and audit, railways, forests, revenue, etc. are appointed in ministries that have little to do with their domains. But while for non-IAS officers the change has been a long time coming, for IAS officers, this is a deliberate attempt to sideline their service, whose officers keep shuttling between states and the centre, thereby making them politically less committed to one dispensation. As pointed out to us by a retired IAS officer, unlike IAS and IPS officers, officers of the central civil services like the railways, revenue, etc. are entirely creatures of the centre, thereby making them more committed. For officers of non-IAS services, though, the reason they are flourishing is because this government rewards merit over service. As a railway officer working as a joint secretary in one of the central ministries told us on condition of anonymity, for my seniors, going to ministries that have nothing to do with railways on deputation, where you are actually made responsible for making national policies, would have been unimaginable. It was not even something that officers of the railways aspired to, because everyone knew that both the political dispensation and the IAS lobby won't let it happen at any cost. An IRS, that is a revenue service officer, said, "The truth is that officers of the central civil services perform exceptionally well when they go to ministries because they are not as entitled as IAS officers," he meant, and are ready to put in all the time and effort that is needed. Even without the perks, which have reduced considerably in the Modi government, he said they are ready to slog. While the Railways and Revenue Service officers make up only 13.5% and 10% of the total joint secretaries in the government, these numbers are much higher than what could have been imagined before. The reason behind the high number of railway officers in particular is the large cadre of the railways. One officer told us that they have a pool of about 10,000 officers, so obviously their numbers in the government are much higher. Besides, he said the railways is a 24/7 organization, so they are ready to put in the work even when they come to ministries. Similarly, the revenue service officers, one IRS officer told us, have enormous experience in filings, notings, making submissions, etc., which is all work that comes very handy when they go to ministries. But it's not just within the government. IRS officers have had good prospects under the Modi government even post-retirement. From Sushil Chandra, who went on to become the Chief Election Commissioner, to KV Chaudhary, who became the Chief Vigilance Commissioner, IRS officers have been rewarded handsomely under the Modi government. But it is not just railway or revenue officers who are in demand. Officers from much lesser known and coveted services like the Indian Audit and Account Service, Indian Defence Account Service, among several others, too are occupying very important positions in ministries such as Defence, Home, Law, Justice, Water Resources, to name just a few. But all this does not mean that there is an increased focus on domain expertise. 6 years after the Modi government announced the lateral entry scheme, there are only 3 officers who have been recruited laterally from the private sector who are currently working as joint secretaries. While the tenures of the first batch of lateral entrants has ended, the government was forced to withdraw, as many of you will recall, its recent advertisement for lateral entry, including for 10 JS level positions. But the absence of domain expertise is not just on account of the lateral entry scheme. It has been the sustained position of non-IAS officers that they are domain experts while IAS officers are generalists. Therefore, they believe that they should be the ones making policy in their respective domains. Now, by this logic, Indian Police Service officers should man the Home Ministry, Indian Forest Service officers should be in the Environment Ministry, Revenue Service officers and those from Audit and Accounts should man the Finance Ministry. But this is not quite the case. Despite the increased representation of non-IAS officers in the central ministries, there is no visible attempt at matching their domain expertise with their appointments. Consider this. The lone IPS officer posted as Joint Secretary is posted in the Ayush Ministry. Indian Forest Service officers are posted in ministries ranging from health to road transport and highways. Officers of the Information Service are posted in ministries such as Labour and Employment and Higher Education. Meanwhile, railway officers are posted in ministries like Food and Public Distribution, Rural Development and even Culture. There is no domain expertise in these appointments, pointed out an IAS officer. Bringing them is just a way to break the morale of IAS officers who the government has had suspicion towards from the beginning, he said. There is a certain kind of dynamism that IAS officers bring to the table, he said. But given that the position of the Joint Secretary has ceased to be a position of actual decision-making and has been turned into a position of just executing decisions made in a very centralized system, there is no dynamism required in the job anymore, he said. Yet, there are also murmurs that the increased representation of central civil services has to do with the fact that they are more pliable than IAS officers. A retired IAS officer told us that IAS officers by definition have political flexibility, unlike officers of the railways, revenue and other services who report to the centre from the beginning to the end of their careers. The central service officers, he said, are entirely the creatures of the centre, so it is easier for the government to get them to do their bidding. The fact that the Modi government has overhauled the Indian bureaucracy and completely changed its culture is another factor, according to officers. The days when IAS officers could exude enormous power in the government and still go off to play golf at 5 p.m. have gone, said an IRS officer. The centre now makes its officers slog. They have to log in by 9:30 p.m. and go home late in the evenings. As a result, IAS officers simply don't want to come to the centre because there is so much more comfort and even status in the states. If one looks at the number of non-IAS officers at director levels, the numbers would be even more astonishing. The railway officer we've quoted above also echoes this exact sentiment. The position of the Joint Secretary is not what it used to be during UPA years, he said. There is enormous surveillance in the government at the centre, a lot of work and also diminished say. So non-IAS officers who are happy to work without the power that comes with being a DM of a district are happy to slog quietly. Despite the dramatic changes, however, some non-IAS officers say that the disparity between IAS and non-IAS officers actually persists. In 2015, some of you may recall, the 7th Central Pay Commission weighed in on this perennial debate in the Indian bureaucracy. Coming as a jolt for IAS officers, the Commission came down heavily on them, arguing that the main cause for resentment among services is that over a period of time, the IAS has arrogated to itself all power of governance and relegated all other services to a secondary position. It is time that the government takes a call that subject domain should be the criteria to man the posts and not a generalist. One of the biggest complaints of non-IAS officers has been the allegedly discriminatory empanelment rules which favour the IAS, who are typically promoted 2 years earlier than officers of all other services. They also receive 2 more increments than them and are empanelled for positions in central ministries far earlier in their careers than their non-IAS counterparts. Even now, if you see, while the last batch of IAS officers to be serving as Joint Secretaries is 2008, for services like the Indian Information Service, Forest Service, Central Secretariat Service, it is 1998, 2003 and 1999 respectively. Speaking of this disparity, the IRS officer we've quoted above said, this shows clearly how the system has been manipulated and controlled by the IAS lobby for years, such that they have successfully ensured that no other service flourishes. Even now, they control key ministries like the Department of Personnel Training, the Prime Minister's Office, the Cabinet Secretariat, etc. entirely to make sure that the changes that have happened have not been institutionalized. However, the IAS's diminishing numbers in the government could have an adverse impact on governance in the long term. This is the view of former Finance Secretary Arvind Mayaram. He says the shuttling that happens between the centre and states actually leads to nationwide consistency and reflection of central government policies at the state level. He said, considering diversity, it is necessary that ground realities are reflected in policies. That is why IAS officers must go back to the states for a number of years before returning to the Government of India after every 5-year central deputation. Central service officers do not bring that experience to the table, he said. It is not a reflection on their competence. It is their work experience which is telescopic and of a specialized nature, he added. You can read more about this perennial debate between IAS and non-IAS officers in our story published on ThePrint.in. Thanks for watching.